Good morning. Welcome to episode number 7 of the ZoomTown experiment. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Powertrain Deck, or the lowest component or chassis component of the entire Zoomie. Here's what we're going to look at in today's video. We're going to cover a brief explanation of the powertrain subassembly, the lower deck, its functions and features, the motor mounting, wheel construction, ball caster for omnidirectional support, and a review of the subassembly. This component here is the lower deck. To it, we're going to mount several components, and the rest of the entire Zoomie all gets built upon this deck. Let's take a quick look at some of the functions and capabilities of this lower deck. It serves as the base chassis for the entire Zoomie. It provides mounting locations for the motors, motor drive, drive wheels, ball caster, mounting for all other decks, DC to DC converter for 6 volts, and it must be fairly solid and rigid in order for it to provide a good foundation for the rest of the Zoomie. Here is a 3D animation of the assembly that I've created in Fusion 360. All of this design work is done in Fusion 360, and it really helps to minimize the number of mistakes when you get to real components. But as you can see, all the components just kind of fly in and fit in those locations. Now, in truth, it never really works that easily in the real world, but we're going to go down that path as we're moving forward in this particular video. Back to the 3D graphic, you can see how, let me roll it over. Here's the ball caster. The motor's hiding underneath this red piece, and that's really just a temporary clamp per se for the motors. Eventually this will be incorporated into another whole device that will serve to support a lot of the sensors that the Zoomie's going to have. But you see how the wheels are just press fit onto the axles. Then there's this cage up here that contains the DC to DC power supply, and then our motor drive. Over here on the bench, we can see all the components, and I want to point out where each component came from so that you can follow along here further in this video and the whole project. This is the lower deck, 3D printed. And by the way, this one's already been revised, so a few of these components will be earlier versions rather than the current version. But that's a 3D printed lower deck. This is just the temporary clamp for the motors. I already mentioned what we'll be changing that with. And here are the 2 3D printed wheels where the O-rings would go to make up the full wheel assembly, which would be the wheel, or rim as some people would call it, and then the tread or tire, which is an O-ring. We've got another device here that serves as a cage to contain our motor drive and our DC to DC converter. I like to use 3mm screws for my assemblies. They can either be machine screws such as these, where you would drill and tap the holes. I'm a machinist, so that's my favorite way, but you can also use self-threading screws in this PLA. And by the way, all the components will be printed in your basic PLA. I'm not going with all the cool new fancy stuff, the super tough and the ultra tough and the whatever they come up with a cool marketing name for. Plain old PLA works good, works easy. Before I go through and assemble all these components, let's first take a quick look at the wheels and their features. We have 2 drive wheels. They mount directly to the motors. The motor's output shaft serves as the axle. They are friction fit, so they're just pressed onto the axle. They are 3D printed, and they have O-rings for tires, and these provide good traction. There is a single ball caster, ultimately making up a tripod base for the Zoomie. And this allows for omnidirectional movement as well as support. And it's a purchase component. And now we'll take you through a quick physical assembly of these components. And that is the rough assembly for the lower deck. Now the DC to DC supply and the motor drive, those will actually just be trapped in here. The next deck coming in will be right above these, and our connectors will be coming in from the sides. So they really won't go anywhere because they can't come out of those little nests. Underneath, now you'll notice I've got a large gap between the motors in this area. In the final build, these wheels will be closer in, and those two motor backsides will be almost touching. So I must make sure I put an insulator of some sort so that the contacts for the two motors don't touch each other. Otherwise, we very well could have some short circuiting going on. That'll come up a little bit later in the build process though. You'll notice that over in this area and over here, we've got some cutouts. Those are for wires to pass up from the bottom should we need it. And then back here would be the motor wires coming up to connect to the motor drive. So rather compact, fairly stable, tripods generally are, and pretty easy to work with. Well, so far the design and the build is coming together nicely. We've got a few components. They seem to fit together well. We've got a stable base. That's a good starting point. Next week, in episode number 8, we're going to start looking at sensors that we'll be needing for the Zoomie. So I hope to see you next week in that episode. Thanks for watching.